I'd like to talk to you this evening about technique in medicine. For the last few weeks, when I tell my family and friends that I'm going to Trinity to talk, and they say, "What are you talking about?" And I say, "Technique in medicine," they look at me and go, "Really?" Technique is a word that we all know and use. When I tell you that I'm a second clarinetist and that I need to practice my clarinet technique, you know what I mean. Although you would justifiably question, what does that have to do with bioethics? But the sense in which I'm going to use the word this evening is different. I'm going to follow, among others, Jacques Ellul, a 20th century French political and social scientist, theologian, and philosopher of theology, who used the term technique to describe a phenomenon that is a defining aspect of contemporary life, and which I will argue has become a defining aspect of medical practice, and one which has much to do with bioethics. This concept of technique is one that we're probably not familiar with, so our first task will be to get clear in our heads what exactly it is we're talking about. Rather than start with some abstract definitions, I'll try to convey what technique means and what it feels like with a few stories. So first, a little story about myself. As I mentioned, I'm a second clarinetist, but that doesn't pay the kids' college bills, so I'm also a family physician, which means I'm not very good at keeping time, so I apologize if we run over. I grew up in Waukegan, graduated from Calvin College, now Calvin University, with an English degree. And then I went on to the University of Illinois in Chicago medical school. And somehow during those long hours, I met and married my wife of now 30 years, Amy. And then I completed a family medicine residency in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And we moved to the little tiny town in Wisconsin called Darlington. There we go. Darlington, Wisconsin is an idyllic town of 2,400 people, the largest town in Lafayette County, a county with no traffic lights, county with 16,000 people, 32,000 cows, and a county with one medical practice, which was our family practice. We ran the 20-bed hospital next to our clinic and the 90-bed nursing home, and pretty much took care of the county. And it was in this rural setting that I discovered what I believe to be the core of medical practice. It was here that I grew to understand that relationship is at the heart of medicine. And the patient-physician relationship is the medium of healing, but as tenuous as a spider's web and requires the utmost respect and dedication to preserve. The most basic economy of medicine is two people in a room, one person coming to the other and telling that other person a story in the hope that that other person can help them to rewrite that story, or perhaps to learn to live with it better. The hope and the trust that that other person will use their expertise to seek only to help them. That other person may be a complete stranger, maybe a person with whom one has spent but a few minutes out of a lifetime. And yet that first person is willing to expose sometimes even the darkest recesses of heart and body to this stranger. I don't think it's hyperbole to call the trust embodied in that relationship sacred. So this is the first important point that I would like us to remember. Medicine is about relationships, human relationships. I would also add to this characterization the second important point from Robert Song's book, Human Genetics, that situates the practice of medicine theologically. He writes, "For Christians, physical healing has always been viewed in the light of salvation in Jesus Christ. Care of the sick, grounded in the compassionate sharing of the sufferer's pain, and seeking ways of alleviating and perhaps curing it, is a witness to God's work of redemption in Jesus Christ." Well, in the midst of this idyllic existence as a country doc, I became restless and inadvertently started to develop an interest in academic medicine. Ultimately, my family left Darlington and we made our way back to the Chicago area, where I took a position as a core faculty member, as Mike was mentioning. Another story. Right before we left Darlington, Wisconsin, I was talking to my senior partner, Bob Bernardoni, about the impending move. Now, Dr. Bernardoni was a great physician, a terrific mentor, a terrific resource. I think that he practiced medicine mainly to support his farming hobby. But nonetheless, as we were talking, Bob looked at me and said, "You know, you're going from being a big cog in a small machine to being a small cog in a large machine." I didn't think too much of his statement at the time, but it's haunted me over the years as a presciently wise observation. And it provides a start as a metaphor that we'll use this evening for this concept of technique. So let's take Dr. Bernardoni's statement apart a bit. What is a machine? Think about a machine. What are its characteristics? It's a device for performing a particular predetermined task. It's a means toward an end. It's rationally designed by someone. Someone had a problem, a task, an outcome that they wanted to achieve, and they designed a machine to solve the problem, to complete the task, to achieve the outcome. The machine generally does the same thing over and does it in the same way each time. So there's uniformity, standardization, predictability, ideally at least. When something spontaneous happens, it usually means that something's gone wrong. A machine's actions are measured and evaluated by efficiency. Changes and modifications in machines are usually in the direction of increasing efficiency. It would be a soon unemployed engineer or technician that deliberately modified a machine to make it less efficient. So what would it be like if we were a cog in a machine? What is a cog anyway? I had to look that one up. A cog is one of those little, on a gear, it's one of the little spikes, the little teeth on the gear. So what would it be like if we were a cog in a machine? Another way to ask that is, what would it be like if our environment were a machine? Well, that environment would be characterized by predictable means and methods. It would be rationally designed, favoring uniformity, not welcoming spontaneity. It would be standardized and oriented towards efficiency. So that may be a helpful way to start thinking about this concept of technique. Jacques Ellul's definition from his book, The Technological Society, is that in our technological society, technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. Clear as mud, right? Let's take that apart a bit. He starts out in our technological society. So it's a sociological concept. Technique is the totality of methods in every field of human activity. So technique is about methods or techniques or means towards an end. And this concept of technique is totalitarian. It's not just about individual methods or techniques, but about the whole mass of techniques, what we'll refer to sometimes this evening as the technical phenomenon. Technique encompasses every field of human activity: economics, law, medicine, communication, politics, education, amusement, sport, relationships, sex, etc., etc. These methods, he writes, are rationally arrived at, as opposed to being spontaneous or instinctive or intuitive. They've been carefully studied and implemented, and they have absolute efficiency for a given stage of development. There's only one overarching criterion by which all these methods have been evaluated and chosen and implemented, and that's efficiency. So the term technique refers both to the vast mass of techniques or methods that characterize our modern world, and to the cultural dynamic that creates this mass of techniques and shapes the way that we and contemporary society respond to them. So technique is not equivalent to technologies or machines, but our illustration of the machine, of being a cog in a machine, can help us to understand this concept of technique. Because technique involves taking all of human activity and subjecting it to the methods of the machine. It's the standardizing of everything, the rationalizing of everything in the sense of making it rational as opposed to spontaneous or intuitive. The taking of everything taking of everything qualitative and making it quantitative. Technique transforms everything it touches into a machine. It's the spirit of machineness. It's the dominant spirit of our age. It's our mindset. It's our orientation. It's become our environment. In that respect, it's like water to a fish. You can't even see the water around this fish, right? He can't either. It's just part of what he swims through. This makes it very difficult for us to see and understand and think about its effects and repercussions. Humans haven't always been immersed or encased in a technical system. Of course, people have used techniques since the first tool was invented. But in previous times, techniques and technologies were applied in accordance with and subservient to the cultural environment and values in which those techniques were developed. For instance, in ancient Greece, things like the development of techniques and scientific advancement occurred. However, they didn't engulf society the way that they do today. As Ellul notes in the Technological Society, the Greeks had a certain conception of life, a preoccupation with wisdom, balance, harmony, and moderation, which directed and placed limits upon how they used their techniques. The Greeks deliberately economized on means, and they fiercely resisted the unrestrained force inherent in technique. Neil Postman writes that the Greek philosophers believed that nobility of mind was not enhanced by efforts to increase efficiency and productivity. Efficiency and productivity were problems for slaves, not philosophers. The scientific study of nature for the Greeks was not for the purpose of devising new techniques so that we could make nature into a tool for eliminating human suffering and increasing our power and our choice. That's what's been called the Baconian project. Rather, the study of nature was for intellectual satisfaction and the increase of wisdom. Even as late as 17th century Europe, Ellul writes, more and more the need was felt to create new means, but the framework of society, the ideas and currency, the intellectual positions of the day were not favorable to their realization. They ran up against the profound humanism which still haunted the 17th century. It believed not only in knowledge and respect for the human being, but in the genuine supremacy of man over means. It was only during the 18th and 19th centuries that the nature of techniques and their interaction with culture changed radically in the Western world. Many things converged during these tumultuous times. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution and the loss of much social stability. It was also at this time that the close link between scientific research and technical invention developed. And the amazing successes of those principles of scientific research applied to invention led to the widespread acceptance of this notion that applying the principles of scientific research to all aspects of life would be a good thing. So those qualities that make scientific research so successful, things like objectivity, reductionism, standardization, the reduction of all characteristics to quantitative measurements, and the subsequent classification of anything that can't be quantified as subjective and therefore less valid, those qualities were being and are being accepted and firmly established and extended into all domains of life. Technique has become, like the water for the fish, our environment. And this can be hard for us to grasp because we are like the fish in the water of technique. Here's another example to try to illustrate the difference between the mindsets of our technological age and prior ages. Think about comfort. What does comfort mean to us? For us, it mostly revolves around various techniques and technology. Easy chairs, air conditioning, or in this case, central heating. Remote controls, large screen TVs, jacuzzis. Comfort is associated with material life and is increased by the accumulation of machines. By contrast, before our technological society, the time given to the use of techniques was short compared with the leisure time devoted to sleep, conversation, games, or best of all, to meditation. According to the Swiss historian Siegfried Gideon, for people in the Middle Ages, comfort represented a feeling of moral and aesthetic order, a certain arrangement of space. Comfort was the mark of the man's personality on the place where he lived. And when it had been realized, the man of the Middle Ages didn't care if his rooms were not well heated or his chairs hard. Comparing this technique-barren conception of comfort with our technique-laden conceptions may help to illustrate the difference that technique has made in our mindset and our orientation. C.S. Lewis writes of this in The Abolition of Man. He says, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been to learn how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For applied science, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique." Notice there how technique directs not just the questions we ask, but the answers we seek. Here's another example from last Sunday's Chicago Tribune. It reads, 3 easy ways to make people like you that are backed up by science. In a pre-technological age, I think that people would have shuddered at this or been completely befuddled or just laughed and rolled their eyes. For all of human history, friendship has been intuitive, innate, spontaneous, even mysterious. What is it about two people that draws them towards each other in friendship? But now we have research that helps us discern the most efficient techniques for making oneself liked by others. People once lived and moved in the natural environment, ruled by natural necessities. As technique advanced, it forced the men and women with whom it came into contact to adapt themselves to it. The rhythms of the natural world of dark and light, rain and sun, winter and summer, drought and plenty, used to determine the shape of human existence. Technology has freed us from many of those natural constraints that our ancestors struggled against. We've banished space with dazzling means of rapid travel. We've banished darkness, and with it the constricting rhythms of night and day. And in the well-lit, climate-controlled family medicine residency office in the basement of my hospital, I can work oblivious to days and nights, the weather. There could be a nuclear catastrophe above me, and I would continue to work, would be completely oblivious to what's going on up there. But this freedom from natural constraints, Ellul writes, has come at a terrible cost, an even greater subjection to the forces of artificial necessity, of the technical society which has come to dominate our lives. The forces of our artificial necessity of the technical society which has come to dominate our lives. Think of the DMV, or of our bondage to our screens, or of assembly line workers tending to their machines, or of that maddeningly annoying little spinning beach ball on our screens. We now live in the artificial environment ruled by the technical necessities that technique has created for us. Yet there's a seeming paradox. I said that technique has created this for us, but it's actually people who have created the myriad of techniques that make up the phenomenon we call technique. Who or what is in control here? The answer is, of course, that humans are technically, no pun intended, in control, but we're letting another hand on that tiller to steer the boat, the means and the devices that we've created. In one sense, we choose to do this, but in another sense, we are so conditioned to do so, and our whole disposition is so oriented toward technical progress that we hardly recognize it, and we're unwilling to resist or control it. We are awed by our techniques. They're so cool. Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, in his book, Humanism and the Physician, wrote this: people have always sensed that the more they forged and the more machines they built, the more they were forced to know, to love, and to serve those devices. I think Dr. Pellegrino is right to an extent. However, I don't know that we so much sense anymore, because after technique has been our environment and mindset long enough, our senses become dulled to how much we love and serve our devices. So what does this have to do with medicine and ethics? What's the big deal about technique? Hasn't it brought about the modern comforts and standards of living that so many of us enjoy? Well, yes, it has. But if we stop there, asking only what we have gained by the advance of the technical phenomenon, we may miss the equally important question of, what have we lost? The question may be answered more clearly if we take a deeper dive into some of the characteristics of technique. We'll start with several that Ellul describes. First, technique displays what he calls automatism. We've already mentioned that efficiency is a prime characteristic of technique. And what is efficiency? It's the measure of some output or production of a system as compared to the input or the cost or the energy that goes into the system. It's the standard by which all techniques, all technologies are measured. It's the main value of technique. It's the main value of our age. Yet how do we figure out efficiency? We measure something, we calculate it. When it comes to comparing different means or techniques for accomplishing a task, we don't choose between them in any sense in which we normally use that word choose. We merely tabulate. We do the math. My teacher always said on the math test, there's only one answer, only one right answer. We calculate, and the technique that is most efficient is the one that we choose, or rather the one that's chosen for us. Whereas at one time, techniques were chosen based on various human motives, aesthetics, culture, philosophy, religion, belief. mere preference. In the technical system, there's only one criterion for choice: maximum efficiency. But this isn't choice. This is tabulation. Machine could do the same thing. What have we lost? The freedom to choose. Here's a species of predestination that might even make a Calvinist squirm a little. Because efficiency is about math, technique likes numbers. It doesn't deal well with qualities, so it turns all qualities into quantities. How happy are you today on a scale from 1 to 10? How attractive is that guy on a scale from 1 to 10? Even intelligence has been turned into a quotient, a quantity, as if we could measure somebody's intelligence by a number. If something can't be turned into a quantity, it's dismissed as subjective, not significant, somehow less true than what we can measure with numbers. Ellul also describes techniques self-augmentation. Every technical advance creates new unforeseen problems, problems which can most efficiently be solved by more techniques. And in our technical society, we are so enthusiastic about technique, so assured of its superiority, so oriented toward technical progress that we continue, without questioning it, to create new techniques to solve the problems created by the old ones. And these new techniques themselves create new problems that can only be solved by further techniques. And these further techniques, you get the picture. Here's one example from the field of medicine. In this example, the electronic medical record, or EMR, a pervasive technique we'll talk more about later, tends to turn doctors into data entry drudges, serving the machine, spending the precious few minutes we have with patients examining a screen rather than the patient, and those precious evening hours at home on the computer continuing to enter data into the machine. The solution to the problem that the technology created? More technology. Suki, the AI assistant who will fix our documentation woes. It only remains to be seen what burdens Suki will create that will need further augmentation of techniques to fix. So self-augmentation doesn't mean that machines become like rabbits and come to life and start multiplying, but it means that in our technical milieu, we are so oriented towards technical progress that without a second thought, we naturally embrace the technical solutions to any problem, including those problems that our techniques presented us with in the first place. Another story, in 1978, the first test tube baby born using in vitro fertilization, or IVF, was born. Since then, techniques for genetic testing of embryos formed via IVF have been developed and are used widely. A few weeks ago, I attended a lecture given by a member of the Ethics Committee of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. The subject was whether it is ethical to transfer into the womb embryos that were tested and found to have a genetic anomaly. Aside from the horror-inducing primary subject of the presentation, she also talked about the genetic modification of embryos and why we shouldn't be doing it. I'll give her that. But in one of the conclusions at the end of the talk was, genetic modification of embryos is coming, it's going to happen, so get ready for it. Think about that. Something that we think is wrong, something that we do that requires active actions by human beings so that we theoretically could control it, is seen as inevitable. That's a powerful picture of the reality of technique's effects. What do we lose? Control over technique, the option to improve ourselves rather than improving our techniques, the possibility of human progress rather than technological progress. Ellul also writes of the unity of all the techniques in the technical system we're calling technique. He uses the term monism. Everything which is technique is used as soon as it's available and whether it's actually needed or not, and is used everywhere it can be applied. Humans catalyze rather than control the augmentation of technique. We are so enthusiastic about technique, so assured of its superiority, so immersed in the technical milieu that we assume that more technology is good. We automatically apply it everywhere it can be applied. Have you ever said to yourself, well, I bought it, so I guess I better use it? You've experienced this then. Another example is digital internet technology. What started out as a method for government researchers to communicate with each other via their massive and movable computing machines they had then, has become something to which we and our houses and our major appliances are all connected via the devices we carry around in our pockets or even wear on our wrists. It doesn't end there. It doesn't even do any good to question, do we really need smart toilets or internet-connected underwear? In our technical system, such things are inevitable. In fact, you can go online and get them now. What have we lost? Maybe the ability to live without our technologies? Has anyone ever felt like they just want to throw away their smartphone? I see lots of heads nodding. I certainly have, but I can't. Or at least that's what I tell myself. So notice what's happened here. Instead of our techniques being means to an end, the means have become the ends. Technique turns means into ends. We don't ask, why should we use this technique? The means have become self-justifying. We use techniques because they exist, because technology is cool and it should be used. John Wilkinson writes that technical civilization is committed to the quest for continually improved means to carelessly examined ends. What have we lost? Lowell also writes of technical universalism. I think a manifestation of this is globalization. In past times, different civilizations followed different paths. Today, all civilizations are increasingly oriented on technical principles. And city centers around the world start looking like each other, filled with the same stores, selling the same goods, and the profound spiritual and material effort of generations of human beings is being replaced by the calculation of the technician. Lowell also writes of the autonomy of technique. There's a good medical ethics word, right? Autonomy. Yet this is different than patient autonomy. It's based in our inability or refusal to interfere with efficiency, which is technique's only value judgment. But you might have noticed that efficiency is not a value judgment with any moral content. To say something is more or less efficient says nothing about its goodness or badness. You can feed people more efficiently. You can kill people more efficiently. Efficiency itself is not good or bad, but when it becomes the sole benchmark for evaluation, then it permits the expansion of technique regardless of considerations of morality. What do we lose? The ability to choose and control our techniques based on moral and ethical standards. And as the technical system grows, what is the main obstacle to ever increasing efficiency? It's me. I'm human. I'm variable. I get tired. I want to do things spontaneously. I want to do things that sometimes make no sense. I accomplish more or less based on how much sleep I got last night, or whether my back pain is acting up, or whether my children are having a hard time. I'm variable. I make mistakes. I'm unpredictable, despite what my wife says about me. So techniques are devised to help humans adapt to the technical environment. Techniques of mass entertainment, wellness, propaganda. Technical autonomy implies that rather than adapt techniques to humans, humans must be made to adapt to technique. Have you ever noticed that when something advertises itself as user-friendly, you better watch out because it's probably anything but? No, we have to adapt ourselves to the techniques that we have made. What have we lost? One other significant aspect of technique, which Neil Postman emphasizes, is that each new individual technique or technology carries within it an idea or an ideology. Techniques are often portrayed as value neutral. It's not the technique that carries the moral content, rather it's how we use it. The old guns don't kill people, it's people that do it. But each new technique changes, sometimes imperceptibly, our assumptions about the world and how we function in it. And it does so based on qualities inherent in the technique itself. How people think about defending themselves or killing other people would be different in a world without guns than in the one that we have. Each new technique carries within it the seed of an idea. And technical change, therefore, is not just additive, but ecological. For example, when one adds the EMR, the electronic medical record, into medical practice, one doesn't just have medical practice plus the EMR. One has a different medicine, a different idea about medicine, a different practice of medicine, a different concept of what makes up medical practice. Okay. Wow, I've spent a lot of time trying to explain this concept of technique. I would sum it up by saying that technique refers both to the vast mass of techniques or methods that characterize virtually every field of human activity in our modern world. It also refers to the cultural dynamic that leads us to create this mass of techniques and shapes the way that we in contemporary society respond to them. So let's talk a little bit about the surrender of medicine to technique and what that means. So the history of technique's effects in medicine parallels its developments in other areas. Jewson traces the transformation in how medical knowledge was created and validated in the 18th and 19th centuries, from bedside medicine through hospital medicine to laboratory medicine. Bedside medicine didn't have a lot of efficacious techniques to offer. So different doctors had different theories and therapies, and sick people controlled the content of medicine, what was important, by choosing who they thought were the best doctors based on individual characteristics. Thus, the necessity of the trust and relationship that led doctors to view the sick person as a whole person, mind, body, spirit, in a certain societal setting. But then hospital medicine developed, arising first in the large hospitals in France after the Revolution, and doctors gained authority by virtue of their status as doctors, rather than through individual relationships with sick people. Sick people became patients. Patients became more passive. Their main function became to endure and to wait. Patience. Medical knowledge began to center itself more on studies of organs and malfunctions rather than on whole people. Medical knowledge valued the objective. The patient's subjective experience of disease was minimized. The next stage of development was laboratory medicine, in which the researcher took over the management of medical knowledge. Jewson writes, this development represented a significant gain in the social detachment of the medical investigator from the sick. It enabled him to conceptualize the sick man as a material thing to be analyzed, and disease as a physical chemical process to be explained according to the blind, inexorable laws of natural science. Thus, while hospital medicine had dissolved the integrated vision of the whole man into a network of anatomical structures, laboratory medicine, by focusing attention on the fundamental particles of organic matter, went still further in eradicating the person of the patient from medical discourse. What did we lose? That's the research side. On the clinical side, instruments were developed which aided in examination and diagnosis of disease: the stethoscope, the ophthalmoscope, the X-ray, and various advanced ways of imaging. These machines interposed themselves between patients and doctors and helped to create and reinforce the idea of the objective physician. We'll see later that the EMR does that even more, and I don't even get into what telehealth does with that. I don't know if Dr. Sleesman talked about that last time, but the doctor's relationship with the patient became displaced by her relationship with the sounds from the stethoscope and the images from the X-ray machine. As Postman notes, the stethoscope promoted the ideas that medicine is not about the patient, but about disease, and that what the patient knows is untrustworthy, what the machine knows is what's trustworthy. As technology has exploded, multiple ways of treating the patient have been replaced by one way, the technological way. And I think patients sense this, even if they can't express it. One backlash has been the rise of alternative and integrative medicine. But another result of this increase of technology has been a decline in the skills of doctors. I own this, or at least mutations in our skills. Not so long ago, our history taking and physical exam skills were paramount. My not so distant predecessors could listen to a patient's story and auscultate and palpate a patient's chest and diagnose complex problems in the heart. Now, we think we might hear something funny with the stethoscope, so we order a chest x-ray and some blood tests and an echocardiogram. Our skills at attending to the patient have been replaced by skills at interpreting what our machines tell us about the patient. Despite all this, medicine took longer than other fields to be integrated into the vast technical system. Of course, medical practitioners have always used techniques to try to effect healing. But even as laboratory medicine technicized the production of medical knowledge, these techniques were employed and controlled within a framework of caring by independent practitioners working in relationship with their patients. I think that, again, that's part of what kept medical technique from integrating into the vast system of technique. But I believe now that a couple of techniques in particular have hastened our integration into the technical system. First one is the EMR. Electronic medical record. The presence of technology in medicine has been increasing with new surgeries, new scans, new medications, but the EMR is different because those other technologies are usually applied with discretion to individual patients, usually where they're needed the most, in order to refine the physician's ability to diagnose and treat disease. But the EMR is applied universally. And the EMR may seem innocuous, but it insinuates itself into the warp and woof of that most fundamental aspect of what it means to be a doctor, the time that the doctor spends attending to her patient. Its history goes back to the 1960s, when Lawrence Weed first described the concept. In the 1970s, academic and research centers began to implement EMR-like systems in the inpatient setting. In the late 1980s, low-cost computers became available and started to appear in physicians' offices, mostly for billing and coding. In 1996, the VA mandated the use of EMRs in its facilities, but it was in 1999 that the Institute of Medicine published its landmark report, "To Err is Human, Building a Safer Health System," in which it stated that between 48,000 and 98,000 people in America die annually as a result of preventable medical errors. In 2001, the Institute of Medicine followed up with a report entitled "Crossing the Quality Chasm, a New Health System for the 21st Century." Both reports promoted EMRs as a way to reduce medical errors, improve patient safety, and increase the quality of medical care. And then in 2009, the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act was passed, or HITECH. It authorized the use of $26 billion to promote the adoption of health information technology. By 2020, last year, no, 2 years ago now, more than 95% of hospitals and 89% of doctors' offices use an EMR. The rapid adoption of the EMR is unremarkable in one sense, because the government incentivized it, paid for it. In another sense, however, it's very remarkable because there's remarkably little evidence that EMRs either reduce medical errors, improve patient safety, or increase the quality of medical care, the very goals that those Institute of Medicine papers averred would be achieved through EMRs. So why the push from the government to adopt them and the headlong rush of medical care providers to adopt them? Absent actual evidence that it would make a positive difference, the answer would seem to lie in the nature of technique. The computer is a technique that has been rapidly adopted in many other fields. It can be used in medicine, therefore it should be, right? Ellul's monism. The computer is an advanced technology, so it's just got to advance the practice of medicine, make it better, because more technology is better, right? It promises greater efficiency, even if it has yet to deliver on that promise. So it's the obvious choice. But the EMR, like all techniques, carries within it an idea or multiple ideas. One of these ideas can be expressed by a variation on the old maxim, "To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail." That is, to a person with a computer, everything looks like data. Medicine has rapidly embraced the idea that it should be data-driven. It is supposed that the more data we can amass about patients and diseases and treatments, the better we'll be able to treat patients' diseases. Computers are absolutely necessary for recording and manipulating that data. And this will almost certainly be a positive thing for medical practice in many ways. We will have gained much. But what have we lost? Back in 2012, JAMA published an article that had a picture drawn by a 7-year-old girl about her visit to the doctor. And she loved her doctor, and there's the picture of she's sitting on the exam table, and her mom and baby sister are sitting there. And in a corner of the picture, with his head facing away from everybody else, is her doctor, her favorite doctor, staring into a computer screen. Here's another example. This is a commercial from about 6 years ago. I do not endorse the company named in this commercial. I have no idea whether their EMR product is better than anybody else's, but I will say that their commercials are some of the best that I've seen.
Slim pickings.
What do you do?
I stare at a computer screen all day.
Oh, so you're a doctor.
Athena Health. It's time to let doctors be doctors.
No idea whether Athena Health actually lets doctors be doctors. But I can guarantee you, whoa, did I do that? I can guarantee you that no doctor went into medicine so that he or she could stare into a computer screen while the patient sits in the room. But that's what we do. What have we lost by embracing the EMR? One way to answer the question is by asking how EMR has redefined medical practice. When I'm an attending physician on our inpatient service, I still like to go on bedside rounds with my residents. And the residents usually enjoy seeing patients as well, otherwise they wouldn't have chosen family medicine as a specialty. But like all doctors these days, they are required in the course of their work to spend hours in the resident room in front of the EMR's computer screen, attending to what Abraham Verghese calls the eye patient, that digitized body of computerized data, test results, and studies for which the patient in the bed somewhere in the hospital has become the icon. In fact, residents now spend many more hours in front of the screen than they spend in the presence of their patients. And that's pretty much true for all doctors, not just residents. One particular day I was rounding with my residents and I could feel the tension rising in one of them as we went from room to room, taking time to listen to our patients and examine them. Finally, we came out of one of the rooms and she said, when can we finish this so we can go back and finish our work? What did she mean by our work? By our work, she meant getting back to the computers in our resident room, as opposed to listening to and examining patients. It's not difficult to see how the technique of the EMR is redefining just what the work of a doctor is. And it's redefining it in technical terms. It's an ecological change, not merely an additive change. And the EMR, which one would suppose to be the means to the end of a better patient care, has become an end in itself. And we spend hours getting to know and to serve, if not to love, the devices that we have made. What have we lost? Remember that basic economy of medicine I started out with, that relationship? That relationship necessarily involves careful listening and observation, full attention by the professional in order to diagnose and treat correctly. In many, if not most cases, the relationship itself is efficacious for healing. Not only in times past when actual effective treatments were rare, but even today when a vast armamentarium of powerful treatments and medicines lies at our fingertips. The EMR introduces arrival for the patient's attention directly into the exam room. It typically requires a physician to spend large portions of the patient visit focusing attention on data entry, attending to the screen instead of the patient, attending to the needs of the computer for data, in preference to the needs of the person in front of him for his full presence. What have we lost? The primacy of the patient-physician relationship in medical practice, the careful observation of the patient, presence, things basic to relationship like eye contact or body language that says, for this period of time, you are most important to me. The common courtesy of just giving full attention. One person has described us the way we stare at our computers as like texting at the dinner table. What else have we lost? We're losing our doctors. The EMR is one of the main causes of physician burnout in all studies. Somewhere between 40 and upwards of 60% of physicians exhibit symptoms of burnout. This affects how we care for people and affects how likely we are to stay in our jobs as doctors leave medicine in droves. There's much more that could be said about the EMR. I probably said it at one time or another, and I probably said it in language I wouldn't use from this podium. But let's go on to the second of the two techniques that I mentioned that has hastened medicine's integration into the technical system, and that's evidence-based medicine, or EBM. This is a term that came into vogue at the end of the 20th century, defined as the process of turning clinical problems into questions, and then systematically locating, appraising, and using contemporaneous research findings as the basis for clinical decisions. It de-emphasizes intuition and unsystematic clinical experience as sufficient grounds for decision-making. The double-blind, randomized, controlled trial and meta-analyses of those trials are its gold standards of truth. Clinical guidelines, documents which propose the very best way of tackling a clinical task, are its offspring. And adherence to those clinical guidelines have become the standard by which physicians are judged. Now, nobody would argue with using the best evidence for caring for patients. However, EBM, evidence-based medicine, acknowledges only one type of evidence as legitimate: the statistical data that comes from the randomized controlled trial, the RCTs. All other kinds of knowledge are discounted out of hand: observational studies, ethnographic studies, clinical experience, a physician's intimate knowledge of a particular patient in her social situation. EBM has taken the medical world by storm, in great part because it is so very technically oriented and thus fits into and reinforces the technical edifice of medicine particularly well. It bears all the characteristics of technique we talked about earlier. It's the search for the one most efficient means. It relies on statistical analysis to take all quality and turn it into quantity for the purpose of discovering which is most efficient. Thus, it demonstrates the automatism of technical choice. Humans don't choose between means. We merely tabulate the studies and find which is statistically the most efficient. EBM seeks to iron out variations in practice by standardizing all care with these clinical guidelines. Its baleful gaze knows no limits. It weighs every imaginable aspect of the experience of medicine, even the details of a compassionate interaction between a patient and their physician and their patient. It breaks them down into their component parts, measures the parts, and finds which are most efficient. All of medicine becomes technique. Even compassion is tested to see if it works. EBM, as one way of knowing, can enhance the care of patients, but as dogma, it has unwholesome effects on medical practice. Wisdom is scorned in favor of mere data. Sometimes even patients and their complaints are scorned in favor of mere data. As the scientific knowledge and the clinical guidelines gained from the studies come to be seen as more actual than patients or their pain and suffering. EBM interfaces seamlessly with other techniques in medicine, such as computerization in the EMR. In order to make the vast amounts of data generated by all these studies available to a clinician at the place where they're caring for patient, huge searchable databases are created, and computers must be there to access those databases and be made available wherever a physician might need them. So EBM becomes part of this unified whole of the technique of medicine. EBM promotes certain assumptions, certain ideologies. These assumptions are necessary for the knowledge that EBM provides, but they're sinister if they become the underlying assumptions of the practice of medicine. One is the assumption of the average person. This assumption implies that if we study enough people, we'll end up with a composite that can provide us with the truth about the individual patient in front of me. There is, of course, a certain amount of legitimacy in that assumption, because if there were no uniformity among people, then a rational practice of medicine wouldn't be possible. The problem is that very few patients come to me looking just like the average person as the result of the studies. And then to virtually mandate adherence to treatment guidelines, which have been derived from a large population, be mandated to use those in treating this individual patient in front of me is to assume way more than is warranted. The most grandiose assumption of all, however, is that by faithfully adhering to this technique of EBM, we can arrive at truth. The ultimate trump card in any medical debate is the statement, well, the evidence shows, ... When really, if you think about it, all we're actually doing is quantitating our uncertainty, but that's a different story. So these two techniques, the EMR and EBM, have sped medical practice along its way to integration with the vast technical system of our civilization. Much good has come from the techniques used in medicine, but what do we lose? We lose those most basic things about medicine that I started with. We lose the primacy of relationship, the compassionate sharing of the sufferer's pain that is a witness to God's work of redemption in Jesus Christ. Jesus gave people his full attention. He didn't try to look at those he healed objectively. He didn't see them as the average person. He didn't heal them all in the same stereotyped way. As technicized medicine turns our gaze away from the person, it turns us away from a practice centered on relationship with the person. And it is at many places in direct conflict with a relationship-based practice. Because relationship-centered medicine is effective, but it's not always efficient in terms of hours and dollars. Technique strives for standardization of parts and processes. Standardization, one of the things it means is resolving all foreseeable problems in advance. It doesn't trust to inspiration, ingenuity, or intelligence to find an immediate solution when a difficulty arises, because such an approach introduces variation, something that's anathema to machine product. Thus, standardization creates impersonality in the sense that this practice relies more on methods and instructions than it does on individuals. Standardization is appropriate when working with assembly line parts or repetitive processes that are all supposed to be identical. However, a patient-centered practice of medicine which takes into account individual differences on multiple levels, whether biological, psychological, social, spiritual, will find itself in conflict with these various attempts to standardize medical care. Technique's tendency towards reductionism has been successful and useful to medicine, but it's come with its downside. In technicized medicine, human illness and behavior are understood to be reducible to the cause and effect of biological and molecular systems, that laboratory medicine we spoke about earlier. The complexities of human experience are abstracted and addressed outside of their context in the human milieu. Technicized medicine's reductionism mirrors technique's tendency to devalue the singular human capacity to see things whole in all their psychic, emotional, and moral dimensions. And it replaces that with faith in the powers of technical calculation. Medical practice based in relationship is committed to engaging the ambiguity that is at the heart of being human. The technical mindset attempts to eliminate ambiguity by its commitment to quantification and precision. In the technical system, remember, what can't be measured either doesn't exist or doesn't have any value. Patient-centered medicine seeks to discover the subjective meaning of suffering for the patient. Technique effaces all other values and replaces them with its one central value of efficiency, and in so doing, it effaces all meaning. It divorces, the technical approach to the sick person divorces illness from meaning. And as Raymond Downing wrote, denying meaning that is there is certainly counterproductive because it leads us away from healing. A relationship-centered practice understands that it is crucial for the physician to understand the patient's subjective experience, that the physician can't assume a stance of pure objectivity. But, as Neil Postman writes, technique wishes to solve once and for all the dilemma of subjectivity. In a culture in which the machine, with its impersonal and endlessly repeatable operations, is a controlling metaphor, subjectivity becomes profoundly unacceptable. Well, let's take a deeper dive into one more technique. Prenatal genetic screening This is the testing of pregnant women and their unborn children by blood tests, ultrasound, and more invasive means, such as amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, for the purpose of diagnosing chromosomal or genetic or structural anomalies before a child is born. Early in pregnancy, the non-invasive tests are typically offered. However, these tests have a very poor positive predictive value. In other words, most of the abnormal tests are erroneous. So that if patient tests positive, one of the more accurate invasive tests is typically recommended. If all tests point towards the existence of a genetic defect in the unborn child, genetic counseling is offered to the parents, during which the meaning of the tests and the options are explained to them. Now, why were such tests even developed in the first place? It's difficult to imagine that it was only for diagnostic purposes that these tests were developed and marketed simply to provide information to prospective parents. Clearly, these tests were developed to help guide therapy. And because of their close linkage to induced abortion, it seems equally clear that eugenic considerations drove their development. The choice of which tests are developed and which genes are tested for are made by researchers on eugenic grounds. Although the specter of eugenics is denied by the proponents of these tests, and the genetic counseling that's offered is supposed to be non-directive, there's a different story. At least 90% of unborn children diagnosed by amniocentesis as having Down syndrome are aborted. Like the electronic medical record and EBM, prenatal genetic screening bears the characteristics of technique discussed earlier. Increasingly efficient means for testing are automatically applied as they're developed. And when I first started practice, they were applied only to women at highest risk, pregnant women over the age 35, the highest risk for Down syndrome. They're now applied to everybody, screening all pregnant women. This technique is autonomous, it's self-augmenting. It demonstrates the universalizing tendency of technique to extend into all domains of life. As intrauterine humans, previously inaccessible to medical diagnosis, become subjects of laboratory and ultrasound tests. Yet despite these similarities with other medical techniques, PGS introduces a profound difference. Technique in medicine seeks the most efficient means to do things to people and weeds out the less efficient means, but PGS goes a step further. It's similar because it seeks the most efficient way to make a particular diagnosis. But by its close linkage to induced abortion, it also seeks to weed out not just the least efficient techniques, but the least efficient humans. That is, those humans who are thought to provide the greatest anticipated cost, whether in healthcare dollars, heartbreak, emotional energy, or parenting time, compared to the anticipated benefit they'll provide to their parents or to society as a whole. Here again is eugenics. More scientific than the eugenics of the past, far more effective, but still bearing the hallmark of eugenic practice, the belief that some human beings have lives that are less worthy of living than those of other humans. With the EMR and EBM, we've talked about techniques which have the potential to diminish our humanity in the practice of medicine. Here we encounter a technique that takes medicine to a new realm altogether, that of destroying humans in the course of the practice of medicine. The EMR and EBM and other techniques may bewilder, frustrate, and mechanize us, but PGS will kill us, at least some of us. By the only rule that technique unfettered knows, efficiency, this technique, operating upon embryonic humans, aims to filter out inefficient humans. This is a new, if not completely novel, epoch in Western medicine. It's not novel because we've seen in recent history what happens when humans are measured by the yardstick of efficiency, when they're reduced to means instead of understood as ends in themselves. Tuskegee and Nazi Germany's experiments are two of the most prominent. The profession of medicine, once it awakened to what had happened in these terrible episodes, set safeguards to protect people from such techniques, embodied in the protections offered to subjects of human research. These protections introduce and enforce inefficiencies into the practice of human research. In these protections, we see humans placing controls on the runaway use of technique. And it's here that research technicians are constrained to act inefficiently. One formulation of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative is that one should treat humans as ends, never only as means. But if you remember, it's technique's nature to turn all ends into means. And when technique is turned upon humans, when humans become its direct object, then humans become means, and the least efficient means are eliminated. It's here that the dehumanization caused by medical technique begins a deafening crescendo. Where does that crescendo reach its climax? Can't say for sure, of course, but some good story writers have provided us with glimpses of the future, which, while written between 50 and 80 years ago, are disquietingly accurate in their portrayal of the world we see technique creating around us today. C.S. Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man in that hideous strength of a world in which some humans, using scientific techniques in a manner free from all constraint, turn their attempts to conquer nature upon human nature. And to whatever degree they succeed, Lewis demonstrates, their pupils cease to be human at all. They're artifacts. Man's final conquest of nature has proved to be the abolition of man. Aldous Huxley in Brave New World gives us a picture of what a world in which technique turned upon humans might look and feel like. His story takes place in a future in the year of our Ford, 632. And certainly Henry Ford's assembly line is perhaps one of the clearest examples of turning people into cogs in a machine. Incidentally, Ford once called machinery the new Messiah. But Huxley portrays a world in which every denizen has everything his heart has ever desired, except, of course, his freedom. It's a world where techniques, particularly those techniques that act directly upon the human person, have been brought to perfection. And the people that are the product of such techniques, we barely recognize as human. All parental instincts, all notion of sexual fidelity, all aspiration and originality, all reflection, all meaning and purpose, all sadness, all fear of death, all moral judgments of any kind, all strong emotion, in short, anything that might disrupt a person's function in a technological world, have been efficiently conditioned out of people. The most efficient way to run a technological world is to adapt the people who live in it so that they're happy in their artificial environment. So Huxley envisions mass happiness produced in mass humanity by efficient technologies of conditioning, mass media, medication, and eugenics, guided by no considerations of ethics, only happiness, comfort, leisure, and social stability. Huxley shows us a nightmare dystopia where technology and choice combine to bring about a world where pain and suffering are eliminated, but at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. Techniques such as the EMR and EBM used indiscriminately are small steps in the process of dehumanization, subjecting us to efficient machine-like processes. PGS takes the next step of turning those processes upon human beings and carries the operation of dehumanization even further by measuring humans themselves by benchmarks of efficiency. And while Huxley may seem far-fetched in his prognostications, it's simply the logical extension of the technical mindset that informs current day practices, such as PGS, that leads us down the path to the brave new world of Huxley and the abolition of man envisioned by Lewis. Is this end inevitable? I think when Huxley originally wrote his book, he foresaw this as several hundred years in the future. It was sometime in the 60s, he said, maybe 60 years in the future. Two things should be evident from these pictures. First, we're not there all the way yet, but second, it seems like we're going there at an alarming speed. As medicine surrenders to technique and becomes increasingly machine-like, it's not difficult to imagine a day when humans will become irrelevant. When all of the functions currently carried out by humans will much more efficiently be managed by machines. Machines which will never grumble about taking call. They'll never need their work week limited to 80 hours in order to maintain patient safety. Ellul writes, this progressive elimination of man from the circuit must inexorably continue. Every intervention of man is a source of error and unpredictability. The combination of man and technique is a happy one, only if man has no responsibility. Otherwise, he's ceaselessly tempted to make unpredictable choices. So what, if anything, is to be done about this quandary born of the surrender of medicine to technique? Because medicine is, by one definition, essentially a struggle to overcome nature. So it's going to be inextricably intertwined with techniques. So there are some who say the warnings are overblown. The reality is not nearly as bad as the picture you paint. Perhaps. But I think there is a real danger, because we as a society worship efficiency and can't say no to technology. If you're looking for me to bring you a nice, easy answer to the problem, how to fix these problems brought about by medicine's surrender to technique, I don't have them. How to fix that systemic problem is a little above my pay grade. And I'm not advocating for a return to some imagined good old days. I've benefited from modern medical techniques just as all of us have. I do advocate that we become aware of what technique does to dehumanize us, limit us, and turn us into cogs in a machine, and strive to set limits on technique, and strive to offset those effects of technique in our own individual lives. Some thoughts on the individual level. By word and by action, we must keep bearing witness to a world that looks to technology for salvation, that real salvation and freedom are found only in Christ. We have to actively resist the technological imperative. Before we ask, can we do this? We, especially as Christians, must always ask, should we do this? This may mean hard quandaries. It may mean that we appear completely lunatic to our culture. It may mean self-sacrifice. For example, if a cure for cancer or diabetes is discovered, but it requires some immoral technique to killing embryos or something for it to occur, will we as Christians be willing to draw the line if it is us or our sons or our daughters who are on the wrong side of that line? We have to take stock of how much we have bought into our culture's values. The technological project has as its goals things like happiness a la Huxley, comfort, luxury, safety. As Christians, we must be careful not to unthinkingly adopt those things as our highest values. And we must consciously model what we know are the higher values, like self-sacrifice, generosity, hospitality, simplicity, self-sacrifice, taking risks for the sake of others. Even apart from medicine, another cultural tendency we should resist as Christians is the tendency to reduce everything to a technique, to find a technical solution for everything, whether it's a technical problem or not. This is something the church can be prone to itself. We can take the very relational activity of evangelism and reduce it to a machine-like technique. Insert non-believer, put them through the 5 steps or the 4 laws or whatever, and end up with a believer. Or we reduce worship to a technique for manipulating people's emotions. Even some of our sermons approach the scriptures as if they were a technical manual. We hear messages entitled "The Bible's 5 Ways to Have a Happy Life," or 3 Steps to a Better, fill in the blank from Hezekiah chapter 9. Maybe a couple of stories could also provide a foundation for looking at a way forward. Did I mention that there is a burgeoning Amish population in Darlington, Wisconsin? I was privileged to take care of some members of that community. Now, the Amish are stereotyped as being anti-technology, stuck in some century or another before the 20th. But the fact is that they are very well informed and thoughtful about technology. When a new technology becomes available, they carefully evaluate it and compare it with their values before making a decision to adopt it. They're very clear on the things that they value about their family life and their community life. And if on evaluation, a new technology disrupts what's important to them, they either modify it or refuse to use it. For instance, one farmer I knew would not have a telephone in the house, but on the edge of the property, there was a box on a pole with a telephone in it. His community understood that if there was a telephone in the house, it could disrupt their family life because while someone is on the phone, they are drawn out of the relationship to the family at that moment, ignoring those around them in preference to the person on the other end of the line. However, a phone was helpful for his business dealings. A phone on the edge of the property doesn't pose the risk to what they value about family life, but it does serve his business needs. So what did he gain from adapting to technology? Quite a bit without losing what he could have lost otherwise. Now that may sound just so naive to us walking around with phones, but I think it's a remarkable example. Another story, a story I'm sure the author did not write as a comment on technique, but which makes a nice little parable nonetheless, is by Ray Bradbury. He's a writer known for such books as Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles. He grew up where I did in Waukegan. Waukegan plays a part in many of his stories. It's usually called Greentown. My favorite book of his is Dandelion Wine, the story of the magical summer of 1928, where in the life of 12-year-old Douglas Spaulding, loosely based on Bradbury himself. Douglas lives in a big multi-generational home, which takes in boarders and where grandma does all the cooking. Her kitchen is a mixed up, disorganized mess. Bottles and dishes and boxes all over, the labels off most everything. When she cooks, she moves effortlessly around the kitchen in midst of bangings and clatterings, half blind, steam and flour dust everywhere. But her meals are miracles, her cooking legendary, until Aunt Rose comes to stay. Aunt Rose sets out to fix everything. She organizes the chaos, buys grandma a cookbook, replaces her chipped and bent glasses. And the following week is a procession of sad breakfasts, melancholy lunches, and funereal dinners. Grandma's cooking becomes, probably like mine, terrible. Well, Grandpa finally sends Aunt Rose packing, and in the middle of the night, Douglas sneaks into the kitchen and restores the organized cooking ingredients back into the chaos that existed before Aunt Rose. He takes the cookbook and uses it to light a fire. He gets Grandma's old chip glasses out, and then he hides behind the pantry door. Grandma hears the fire and comes down at 1 a.m. And at 1:30 in the deep, dark summer morning, the cooking odors blew up through the windy corridors of the house. Down the stairs, one by one, came women in curlers, men in bathrobes, to tiptoe and peer into the kitchen, lit only by fitful gusts of red fire from the hissing stove. And there in the black kitchen, at 2 of a warm summer morning, Grandma floated like an apparition amidst bangings and clatterings, half blind once more, her fingers groping instinctively in the dimness, shaking out spice clouds over bubbling pots and simmering kettles, her face in the firelight red, magical, and enchanted as she seized and stirred and poured the sublime foods. Quiet, quiet. The boarders laid the best linens and gleaming silver and lit candles rather than switch on electric lights and snap the spell. Grandfather, arriving home from a late evening's work at the printing office, was startled to hear grace being said in the candlelit dining room. As for the food, the meats were deviled, the sauces curried, the greens mounded with sweet butter, the biscuits splashed with jeweled honey, everything toothsome, luscious, and so miraculously refreshing that a gentle lowing broke out as from a pasturage of beasts gone wild in clover. One and all cried out their gratitude for their loose-fitting night clothes. Now, isn't Aunt Rose one of those who's beguiled by technique? Grandma's food is already perfect. It doesn't need improving. If you will, Aunt Rose uses the technique of organization to achieve the end of what? Organization. The means have become the ends, and in the end, they destroy the true end of cooking. It's a homely little parable, I know. But in this case, fixing the bad effects of the technique meant undoing the technique. Is that a possibility for us in some cases? What would we gain? What would we lose? What would that even look like? Well, finally, it would be good for us to take regular Sabbaths from our technology, especially the more intrusive and demanding ones. A time without smartphone, laptop, television. In his remarkable little book, The Sabbath, the Jewish scholar Abraham Joshua Heschel writes this: to set apart one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have so easily been turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature? Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress in the Sabbath? The solution of mankind's most vexing problem will not be found in renouncing technical civilization, but in attaining some degree of independence from it. Heschel sums it up well. Efficient technique is an alluring God, and although Lewis and Huxley do us a service by pointing out the potential dangers of its worship, the dangers are especially seductive for medicine in a society that has not tools to control or judge technique. But if technique is to serve medicine in pursuing the common good rather than medicine serving technique, rather than medicine surrender to technology, turning us into cogs in a machine, we as Christians, knowing the truth who sets us free, have the best hope to attain some degree of independence from technology, harnessing it to human ends, and thus preserving both our freedom and our humanity. And then there are the techniques that we just have to not use, like PGS. This seems like a huge step backwards, but in reality, it may be a huge step forwards. And it's a necessary step if medicine is to continue to be a humanistic profession, if humans are to wrest control of the power of medicine from the techniques they have employed. And in this case, the solution to the problem of power may be to refuse to use it. Thank you very much.